It was a warm Wednesday afternoon when Captain Evelyn Harris stepped out of her unmarked police car. She had just returned from an important meeting downtown, the sun catching on her crisp uniform, making it gleam in the afternoon light. Evelyn was a woman who carried herself with quiet authority, a reputation she had earned through years of dedication and hard work. As one of the highest-ranking officers in her precinct, her presence commanded respect. Tall, confident, and strikingly poised, Evelyn's sharp gaze could assess a situation with laser precision, and her calm, measured demeanor often disarmed even the most tense environments. Today, Evelyn decided to stop by one of her favorite local convenience stores before heading back to the station. The small, corner store was tucked into the corner of an aging strip mall, surrounded by weathered buildings that seemed to tell a story of resilience. It was a place she'd frequented for years, a spot where she often exchanged friendly conversations with the kind, older cashier, Mr. Patel, about the ever-changing dynamics of the neighborhood. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, a familiar sound that usually brought a sense of comfort. But today, Evelyn couldn't shake the slight unease that crept up her spine. Maybe it was just the long day catching up to her, or maybe it was something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Brushing the feeling aside, she offered Mr. Patel a warm smile as he looked up from the counter. "Good to see you again, Captain Harris." Mr. Patel greeted her warmly, his voice tinged with genuine respect. He had known Evelyn for years and admired the way she carried herself both in and out of uniform. "Hey, Mr. Patel," Evelyn replied, her smile easing into her usual confident demeanor. "Just grabbing something quick." She picked up a chilled bottle of water from the cooler and a protein bar from the neatly arranged shelf near the register. As she approached the counter, however, something unusual caught her eye. Standing near the back of the store was a white police officer. His stance was rigid, his arms crossed over his chest, and his icy blue eyes seemed fixed on her every move. Evelyn's sharp instincts, honed from years on the force, immediately picked up on his demeanor. His posture wasn't casual. It was watchful, almost predatory. Her brow furrowed slightly as she tried to place his face. It was rare to see other officers in this part of town, especially one she didn't recognize. He looked younger, probably in his mid-30s, with a chiseled jawline and closely cropped blonde hair. His uniform was immaculate, but the rigid way he held himself made it clear he wasn't here for a casual snack run. Evelyn felt a flicker of annoyance, but quickly dismissed it. She was a captain, not some rookie officer. There was no reason to let the stranger's presence unnerve her. After paying for her items, Evelyn gave Mr. Patel a brief nod and turned toward the door. The moment her hand touched the handle, a voice called out behind her, stopping her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some identification," the voice said, firm and sharp. Evelyn turned slowly, her expression neutral despite the unease creeping into her chest. She found herself face-to-face with the officer from the back of the store. He stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. His tone was laced with arrogance and suspicion, and the look in his eyes sent a clear message. He didn't trust her. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you're asking for my ID," Evelyn said, her voice calm and even. Her years of experience had taught her how to handle confrontations, but she could already feel her patience wearing thin. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," the officer replied coldly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm going to need to see some identification now." Evelyn couldn't believe what she was hearing. Suspiciously? She had done nothing more than pick up a protein bar and a bottle of water. The insinuation was insulting, but the reality behind it was even more infuriating. She knew exactly why this officer had singled her out. It wasn't about her actions. It was about her skin color. "Acting suspiciously?" Evelyn repeated, her voice steady but sharp. "Officer, I'm Captain Evelyn Harris of the Westlake Police Department. I don't need to show you my ID unless you have a legitimate reason to ask for it." The man's eyes narrowed, clearly displeased by her confident response. "I saw you handling merchandise like you were going to steal something," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm asking you one last time. Let me see your ID." Evelyn felt her blood boil. The insinuation that she, a highly respected captain with decades of service, would stoop to stealing a protein bar was not only ludicrous but deeply insulting. And yet, the weight of what was happening began to settle over her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was profiling, plain and simple. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze locked firmly on the officer. "Officer," she paused, glancing at his badge. "Simmons, if you're accusing me of theft, you'd better have evidence. Otherwise, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing. You're making a serious mistake." Simmons' face hardened, and Evelyn could see the flicker of anger in his eyes. His hand tightened on the grip of his gun, and for a moment, she wondered if this situation was about to spiral out of control. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Simmons barked, his voice cold and commanding. Evelyn's heart sank. She blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of his words. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Simmons said, stepping closer, his presence looming. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft." The small store seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in as her mind raced. As a police officer, Evelyn had been trained for high-stress situations, but she had never imagined being on the receiving end of such blatant racism and abuse of power. Every instinct in her body told her to fight back, to push against the injustice unfolding before her. But she knew better. One wrong move, and this could escalate into something far more dangerous. "You don't want to do this, Officer Simmons," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Think carefully about the choice you're making." But Simmons was unmoved. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metallic clinking sound echoing ominously in the small store. Evelyn glanced around, noting the horrified expressions of the other customers. Mr. Patel stood frozen behind the counter, his face pale with fear. He looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. Reluctantly, Evelyn turned around, her back to Simmons. She slowly placed her hands behind her head, her mind racing as the cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. The humiliation was sharp and searing, but Evelyn knew this was far from over. As Simmons marched her toward the exit, Evelyn's heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. Her years of service, her impeccable record, her dedication to justice, none of it mattered in this moment. All Simmons saw was the color of her skin. Stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Evelyn felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Passers-by stopped to stare, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. The sight of a high-ranking officer being paraded in handcuffs was not something you saw every day. Evelyn forced herself to keep her head high, refusing to let Simmons see how deeply this moment had cut her. She was a fighter, and she wasn't going to let him win. The ride to the precinct was silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. Simmons drove with a smug expression, his satisfaction evident in the way he carried himself. Evelyn, sitting stiffly in the back seat, focused on her breathing. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, searching for a way to turn the tables. This wasn't the end of her story. Evelyn Harris wasn't just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Simmons was about to learn that the hard way. Back at the precinct, Captain Evelyn Harris was led down the familiar hallways she had walked countless times before. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different. The air was heavy with tension, and the sound of her boots on the polished floor seemed deafening. Officers she had worked with for years stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. Whispers followed her as she passed, each one like a dagger to her pride. Being a high-ranking officer, Evelyn was used to commanding respect, but now she felt stripped of her dignity. She held her head high, refusing to let the humiliation show on her face. She was led into a small interrogation room, the kind she had often used herself to question suspects. The room was as cold and unwelcoming as she remembered, with harsh fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the bare walls. A steel table and 2 chairs sat in the center, offering no comfort. Simmons stood just outside the door, his smug expression visible through the narrow glass window. Evelyn clenched her fists, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, and fought to keep her composure. Minutes ticked by like hours. Evelyn sat in silence, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the afternoon. The absurdity of the accusation was infuriating. She had been arrested for supposedly stealing a protein bar and a bottle of water. The sheer audacity of Simmons left her reeling. This wasn't just an attack on her character. It was an attack on everything she had worked so hard to build. The door finally opened, and Lieutenant Diana Clark entered the room. Diana was a senior officer, a trusted ally, and one of the few people Evelyn considered a true friend on the force. Her face was a mixture of anger and confusion as she approached the table. "Evelyn, what the hell is going on?" Diana asked, her voice low but filled with concern. She pulled out the chair across from Evelyn and sat down, leaning forward as she searched Evelyn's face for answers. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's Simmons," she began, her voice calm despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "He's trying to frame me for theft. Diana, you know me. You know I would never do something like this." Diana's eyes narrowed as she studied Evelyn. "Of course, I know that," she said firmly. "But this situation looks bad, Evelyn. He's claiming he caught you stealing, and now there's paperwork to back it up. I'll do everything I can to get to the bottom of this, but you need to tell me everything." Evelyn recounted the events in meticulous detail, from her decision to stop at the convenience store to Simmons' unwarranted accusation and eventual arrest. Her voice remained steady, but the anger simmering beneath the surface was unmistakable. Diana listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. When Evelyn finished, Diana leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Paperwork?" Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "How could Simmons fabricate evidence so quickly? This feels premeditated, Diana. He's been planning this." Diana nodded grimly. "It does seem orchestrated," she admitted. "Simmons' report claims there's security footage showing you pocketing the protein bar and water without paying. If that footage exists, we'll find it." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "It doesn't exist," she said sharply. "Because it didn't happen. I paid for everything. Mr. Patel can vouch for me, and the security footage would prove it." Diana's expression darkened. "There's a problem with that," she said quietly. "The footage is missing. The store's system was mysteriously wiped earlier today. It's like someone knew this was coming." Evelyn's stomach sank. Simmons had covered his tracks well, but she wasn't about to give up. "We need to talk to Mr. Patel," she said after a moment, her voice steady but resolute. "He knows I paid. If Simmons pressured him to lie, we can get him to come clean." Diana nodded. "I'll handle it," she promised. "In the meantime, sit tight. I'll make sure this doesn't go any further than it has to." With that, Diana left the room, leaving Evelyn alone once more. The silence in the small space was oppressive, and Evelyn's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for any detail she might have missed. Simmons' behavior, Mr. Patel's unease, the presence of other officers in the area, it all felt orchestrated, as though Simmons had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Hours passed before Diana returned, and this time she wasn't alone. Mr. Patel followed her into the room, his nervous energy palpable. The older man avoided Evelyn's gaze as he sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Mr. Patel," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm, "you know the truth. Tell them what really happened." Patel hesitated, glancing at Diana before speaking. His voice trembled as he finally broke the silence. "Captain Harris paid for her items," he admitted. "I saw her do it. But Officer Simmons came to me earlier this week and told me to report a theft if anything suspicious happened. He said it was a precautionary measure. I didn't know he was going to use it against you." Evelyn felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to remain calm. "Thank you for telling the truth, Mr. Patel," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at Simmons for abusing his power." Diana placed a reassuring hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "This is enough to start an internal investigation," she said. "Simmons has a history of complaints, and this could be the tipping point." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. An internal affairs team was brought in to investigate Simmons, and Evelyn was placed on administrative leave while the case unfolded. It was a humiliating experience, but Evelyn refused to let it break her. She remained resolute, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light. As the investigation progressed, more evidence began to emerge. Witnesses from the convenience store came forward, corroborating Evelyn's account of the events. Records of Simmons' past misconduct surfaced, painting a damning picture of an officer who had been abusing his authority for years. Complaints of racial profiling and excessive force had been buried in the system, but now, with Evelyn's case at the forefront, they could no longer be ignored. Eventually, the truth prevailed. Simmons was exposed for his actions and was removed from the force. The public outcry against his behavior was swift and unforgiving, and Evelyn's name was cleared. She returned to her position with her head held high, her reputation intact. But the experience left a lasting impact, serving as a stark reminder of the systemic issues that still plagued the institution she had dedicated her life to. Evelyn resolved to use her position to drive meaningful change from within. She began advocating for stricter oversight and accountability within the department, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. She spoke openly about her experience, using it as a catalyst to spark conversations about bias and inequality in law enforcement. As Evelyn stepped back into the precinct for the first time since her ordeal, she was met with a wave of applause from her colleagues. Many of them had stood by her throughout the investigation, offering their support and vouching for her character. Their faith in her had never wavered, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for their unwavering loyalty. But Evelyn knew that her fight was far from over. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with resistance and setbacks. But she was ready to face it, stronger and more determined than ever. She was no longer just a captain. She was a force for change, and she was determined to make her department a better, fairer place for everyone. Evelyn Harris's story was no longer just about one woman's fight for justice. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. And as she walked through the precinct, her head held high, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in her journey.